Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul. I'm just going to walk you through the economy as well as government policies for the United States of America, or the USA. Now, my presentation is only one perspective. You're more than welcome to go out to sites like the Bureau of Economic Analysis for the US, as well as like Moody's, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Post areas to get their perspective on what's going on with the US economy as well as the government policies. A little brief bio about myself. I'm a CPA, CGA by trade. My experience on the academia perspective is I've done a lot of work in teaching public sector finance courses as well as different areas of government policy. So I will come from a spin of looking at specific key areas of policy from the economic side as well as taxation in the banking sector. I'll talk about debt to GDP because that's a critical driver in measurements, and I'll talk about other aspects of debt and the economic aspects of the US. Now, if you look at ratios, the debt to GDP, the US is about 104% of its GDP now is tied to debt. That's as of 2015. The US continually is running $100 billion of deficit, and they haven't had a surplus since 2001. And I'll get into more specifics as we move forward. But the key is they have exceeded GDP, debt to GDP by 104% now. T-bills is a key area. This is where the government issues T-bills to finance its government. 58% of those T-bills are tied up with China and Japan. Now, that's interesting because that gives you kind of an idea of two key countries that control a lot of the U.S. debt, and it's something to watch out for. But what's also interesting in this trend is you're seeing the Cayman Islands, which is a huge area for financial services due to their tax policies, as well as Ireland. Ireland's interesting because they were on the verge of a banking collapse, took a bailout of Europe, and they reformed their government by cutting the size of government and putting more focus on trade and exports. And that's something to bear in mind. So some of the excess cash they invested into T-bills. This just gives you an idea. Since 2001, the U.S. government has been running consistent deficits, and that's why you're seeing their debt to GDP grown over time. Now, the U.S. is going through a presidential race, so you're going to see two types of governments looking at. From the Republican perspective, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton from the Democrat perspective. None of them have been clear on anything in terms of economic policies, in terms of reforms, whether that's tax, whether it's the banking sector, whether it's the size of government. It's something to bear in mind as they go through the debates, and the parties from the Republican to the Democrat select their leader to run for the next presidential election. But it's something to watch as they move forward in terms of policies. Income inequality is a big issue around the world. It was talked about big time during the last federal election, but it's not giving a lot of attention in the U.S. And I'm going to pull on this, and this is a video that you can more than apt to pull down from CNN. But basically it shows you that income inequality in the U.S. has grown significantly. There's been challenges there. The top 1% have taken more of the bounty. There hasn't been a lot of reform around to better support the taxation policies. And that's one thing. The other thing is the U.S. has been really slow at doing is redistribution of income. In other words, taking that bounty of tax and putting it back to social programs, whether that's Social Security or education. The U.S. hasn't done significant enough work in that area as compared to Canada, where we've actually done quite well in terms of our taxation policies and the government transfers to the different levels, and that's something to bear in mind as you're going through things. Global forecast is critical because it's going to drive what's going forward. The U.S. is not going through significant strong growth into 2016. It's been downgraded again to 1.9%. That's hardly overwhelming growth, and it's something to bear in mind. This gives you an idea where the GDP has been going in the U.S. They've had a couple quarters where they've actually seen a decrease in GDP, and you're seeing that in 2014. So the economy is not growing by leaps and bounds. The biggest driver of the U.S. economy is 2/3 of that is consumer spending. And as long as there's a healthy consumer spending, that drives the economy. But there are considerable challenges that are happening there on the productivity side. Wages have grown, so we're not seeing a huge influence where we thought possibly we'd be more nearshoring jobs and business investment. It's not growing there. The other issue is the oil prices have impacted the U.S. significantly in key states like Texas, up into Alaska, Oklahoma, everywhere else, and even North Dakota where the fracking's been taking place. So it's something to bear in mind as you watch going forward with policies. Retail sales have shown some uptick, but the last few months have shown a slowdown, and mostly that's been driven by less automotive production or automotive sales, and that's just like Canada. We're seeing a drop down, and that is about 25% of the retail sales, so it's a big volume. So if you see a decrease in that, you're likely going to see an impact on retail sales. But in general, they're still pretty healthy. Nearshoring, this is the idea of bringing jobs back. Obama ran on a campaign that he's seeing more and more jobs. Yes, jobs are relocated, but they've also gone outside of China now to Southeast Asia, to Vietnam and other countries where that labor cost and currency differences is different. So to say that the U.S. is going to get a bounty of these jobs is not necessarily true. What we've seen in North America, we've seen a lot more automotive and other manufacturing going to Mexico. So you're seeing that trend happening. Will there be nearshoring? Yes, to the degree that you'll see it significantly. It's hard to say right now, and it all will depend on different policies from the state to the local government as well as the federal government policies, and that's the thing you have to watch out on part of looking at the nearshoring trends. U.S. trade partners, their top three are Canada, Mexico, and China, and that's something to bear in mind as we move forward. Canada's economy is not growing by leaps and bounds either, and it's a dependency on the U.S., so we still trade about 70% of our goods to the U.S., so it's something to bear in mind in terms of what's happening there. China's not going through leaps and bounds either, but the bulk of the trade deficit for the U.S. and China is a lot to do with consumer goods. The U.S. like cheap goods. That's why you're seeing ports like Long Beach, Seattle, and other ports backlogged at times because of the fact that they're bringing in so many goods from China. And they have a huge China trade deficit. And that's an area that Obama's talked about but hasn't really been able to change that outcome. And it's something to watch out as the statements come from the Democrats and Republicans to the next this upcoming presidential election. Tax. You can't talk about economy without talking about the tax system for business. The U.S. is ranked 64th in the developing countries in terms of their tax policies, and a lot of that has to do with very high corporate taxes. A lot of it also has to do with the amount of paperwork you have to file, because there's so many different tax and user fees from state to local to federal level that come into play. It's something to bear in mind. The next government's going to be challenged in terms of how do they reform the tax code to simplify things to kind of get better control of their revenue, and that's something to watch out for statements in the presidential election as well. The banking sector, the U.S. is pretty healthy in general, even though the ranking's only 39, but a lot of that has to do with they've got a lot more banks in play. But they do go through stringent tests on their capitalization. So in terms of that, based on the Moody's report I looked at, they're still pretty well capitalized. How does it compare to Canada? Well, Canada has very few banks. We have lots of oversights, and we are probably one of the best sectors in the world. So if the U.S. wants to mirror something in terms of policies, they may be looking at what Canada does in terms of the regulation on the banks. This is a brief presentation on the U.S. economy. It kind of gives you an idea in terms of where GDP is growing. It's not growing by leaps and bounds. And there's a lot of issues from the government finances in terms of other programs that come into play. Now, Canada is looking at a cap and trade process. The U.S. hasn't fully embraced that policy, so it'll be interesting how that happens in terms of policies moving forward. The U.S. does heavily give grants to wind and solar power, and it's something to watch out for, because at some point these projects have to become profitable, and bumping them up with taxpayers' dollars doesn't necessarily mean you're doing the most benefit for the dollar. Now, the interesting trend will be with the U.S. government as we see their appreciation with the dollar. If we see a rebound in the housing starts, and that all leads to critical issues. One is it makes exports more expensive. The housing means it's starting to rebound. The concern with the housing market is, do they have the proper controls to ensure that we don't have a breakdown like we saw in 2008, 2009? How healthy is that market again? It's something to watch in mind because of the history with the U.S. housing market bubbles in the past. It's something to watch. Consumer spending is another critical area, but how will that drive as we see maybe reforms with taxation? Maybe we see issues with wage growth. We're starting to see some improvement in there. That's all going to drive some of that factor in retail sales. The world's not a very safe place right now, and that feeds into the whole issue. The only countries that you're seeing huge growth in are China, India, US, parts of Africa. Most countries are growing very slow. The biggest issue now is one of the directions was from the Canadian government, from Prime Minister Trudeau, was to provide a stimulus. Well, stimulus, you have to be careful of if you want to embrace that. First of all, you've got governments like the US, Japan, other countries that got debt that's above 100% of GDP. That debt is future taxes, future programming cuts. So to say that you need to go on a stimulus needs to be very well thought out, and it needs to be strategic in its deployment. Throwing money at a problem doesn't make the throwing the money at a cause doesn't make the problem go away. You have to be very thorough on how you do things. Obama has talked about doing different things by looking at the tax rates, by kind of looking at deferred income taxes to bring money in and using that money in as part of the overall tax structure. A lot of the times when Obama speaks about something, it's a one-off policy that's a short-term fix. He hasn't really pushed structural reforms, whether that's looking at the unfunded liability side or looking at different things in the tax code. He hasn't really pushed those reforms. The next government that comes into the US is going to have very tough decisions when it looks at all aspects of spending and revenue, as well as looking how it supports initiatives to create jobs both domestically, and that being said, how does it do it domestically when you have wide dispersion methods of uses in terms of tax credit programs versus state and local governments up to the federal level? How do you support a strong economy that's driven 2/3 by retail sales? That's going to be the edict on the next government who comes in to do this, because income inequality, which is the big issue in the US, won't be fixed unless you change the reforms of the tax code. And that's something that neither Clinton or Trump have been clear on how that's going to be fixed. The issue is you can't give money to other people, as we've seen in Sweden, they lose that incentive. So you want to ensure that you have the right tools in play that will help the economy, and that's something to watch out as you move forward. This presentation was to give you an overview of the US government, to kind of put things in perspective with what needs to change as they move forward in terms of policies. Thank you.